Should schools teach kids how to brush their teeth? Will borrowing be the big issue at the next election? And should we look again at the laws on assisted dying? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Labour's Deputy Campaign Coordinator Ellie Reeves, Taj Ali from Tribune magazine and Tim Stanley from The Telegraph. Today,
I think actually that teaching kids to brush their teeth is parents' responsibility, but in too many cases that's not happening.
Labour say teaching kids how to do this is not the nanny state.
If you watch someone you love having a bad death, that memory obliterates all the happy times. And I don't want that to happen.
Is it time to change the law on assisted dying?
If they want that fight on borrow to invest, I'm absolutely up for that fight.
Keir Starmer wants to talk borrowing at the next election. Will that be a vote winner?
We're going to continue to bring French people together as part of a great popular movement.
Why are far-right politicians like France's Marine Le Pen popular with young voters? Let's start with the story you saw there in the headlines and show you this headline in the Sun newspaper. Starmer, UK does need nanny state. Yes, criticism of the Labour Party indulging in the nanny state when it comes to young people because Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has said so many of them are in hospital with tooth decay. Keir Starmer goes on to say in that article, the moment you do anything on child health, people say you're going to have a nanny state and we want to fight that. Now, they want to introduce a national supervised toothbrushing programme for 3 to 5-year-olds and ban flavoured vapes aimed at children. Are Labour right about the nanny state?
I think they're wrong to say that the nanny state could ever be sufficient, and that's the implication of what they're saying. Supervising children to brush their teeth during school time it could well be a tiny part of fixing it for some people, but this has to be parents' responsibility. And the nanny state, for me, the challenge of having that conversation is in all these things, it's a balance. But it seems to be that what Keir Starmer says is that the state can supply a solution to almost every problem, and that's absurd. It's never going to work.
Ellie?
Well, of course parents should have responsibility for making sure children brush their teeth, but we've got a situation where hospital admissions for 6 to 10-year-olds, the greatest cause of hospital admissions is tooth decay. 1 in 3 of children in the most deprived areas have tooth decay. So there is a real issue here, and having supervised teeth brushing in school is about prevention, to make sure that we're not putting a strain on the NHS and to make sure that children get the best start in life. So it's absolutely the right thing to do. You know, I was out campaigning in Wellingborough just before Christmas and I spoke to someone on the doorstep. She had 4 kids and she said they had to travel for miles and miles and miles to get an NHS dentist appointment. So, you know, it's really clear that we need to take more action. We need more NHS dentist appointments, but also we need to take these preventative measures in the first place.
Right, but what does Keir Starmer mean by the nanny state in this regard?
Well, look, you know, toothbrushing in schools is something that people might look at it and say, oh, right, this is about the nanny state. But actually, it's also about prevention. It's about making sure that we're preventing these issues, these very real issues, from arising in the first place.
Well, Matt, that sounds reasonable enough.
I'm all for prevention. I just don't see how this, attractive though it might be from a headline point of view, really does the job. And I think what we should be doing is looking both at making sure there is that dental provision, of course we should be, but it's about a culture, and that culture can't say to individuals, look to the state for every solution, because it will only ever fail.
Is that the reason, though, for not doing it, because of accusations that it's the nanny state at work?
Well, I think it's a nonsense debate, to be honest with you. I think this is a very serious problem for a lot of children, and it's linked to a wider problem, which is the scandal of child poverty. We know for a fact that deprivation is linked to poor health outcomes for children. In fact, I'd be asking Labour to go much further than this. I'd be asking them to scrap the two-child cap on benefits, which is the single biggest driver of child poverty, to invest in our young people, to invest in free school meals for young people. We've heard from Keir Starmer talking about giving people hope. I think policies like that would give young people hope. So I think Labour should be very confident in their messaging. You are going to be attacked by the Tories regardless of the policies you pursue. So let's be very proud of the fact that we want to be tackling the ill health of children.
Tim?
What has the benefits that someone receives got to do with whether or not they brush their kids' teeth?
Well, I think that if we have more children who do have better quality of life in the home, you know, we know that child poverty is linked to wider social problems in households. And so, yes, we are talking specifically about children brushing their teeth, but the proposal from the Labour Party is around mental health support for children as well. It's a wider package of support for young people.
But I'm sorry, it takes 5 minutes in the morning to brush your kids' teeth. Why can't a parent do that regardless of their financial situation?
Well, of course there's individual responsibility, but the reality is a lot of parents are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and that inequality, that problem in the household where parents have the financial burden, where children have the financial burden, is absolutely linked to poor health outcomes, including tooth decay, and there is evidence for this. Numerous studies have cited the link between child poverty, between income and between poor health.
But I think I agree with all of that. I think that's self-evident, but there's a bit missing, which is culture and the psychology of parenthood. I'm not against this policy. I think it's a tragedy that it has to happen. And it has to happen either because one thing where I'd agree with you is patterns of work have become such that some parents find it difficult to spend time with kids. I get that. But we also need to ask, quite frankly, what kind of deadbeat parents are not brushing their kids' teeth in the morning? And there needs to be a culture in this country whereby people would not feel it acceptable to send their children either to school without brushed teeth or without having taught their kids how to brush their teeth. I really recommend people read Frank Field's memoir, The Labour Working Class Socialist. He's written a very good memoir in which he touches upon welfare, the psychology of poverty, etc. And he makes the point that half the story, yes, is government cuts, which in the last 13 years have been savage and had a big impact upon poverty. I don't deny that. But he says the other problem is the loss of that Victorian sense of that Victorian culture of pride and self-improvement. And it might be that if we can't rely on people to engender that for themselves, the state has to teach it. So I support Keir Starmer for doing this. I'm not against it. But I think we really need to have a bigger conversation about what kind of society we're living in which people are sending their kids to school without having brushed their teeth.
Those deadbeat parents, Taj.
Well, I think we often have this discussion. Whenever we talk about poverty, we talk about the parents, we talk about benefit claimants, and we've seen consistently in the media the demonisation of working class people. I absolutely believe that parents have a responsibility to ensure that their kids are healthy and to give them the support they need. But also we have to look at the fact that, you know, in-work poverty is at a ridiculous level. People are working very, very hard to provide and they're still struggling. And so the state is definitely an answer to some of the problem.
Right. I mean, isn't that true?
So I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I think in a way it's a shame that we're having a conversation that's focused on a relatively small part of the...
Yes, but it speaks perhaps to a much wider societal problem, as we just heard.
Rather than a conversation that says, how do you provide people with the means to inculcate the kinds of culture that we know is associated with greater wealth? And for me, that comes back to how do you set up an economy that allows that people to have the jobs they need to provide them with the income they need, rather than say, how do you end up looking to the state to do everything?
Right.
That's the fundamental difference.
And what did you make of what Matt said earlier, that Keir Starmer seems to think that the government, the state, needs to step in to solve every problem, to paraphrase you slightly?
I don't think that is the case, but there is certainly an issue here that needs resolving when you've got those statistics around hospital admissions for people with tooth decay. But I don't accept the characterisation of deadbeat parents. I mean, I've lost count of the times that in the morning rush, maybe one of my children has gone out for the day without having brushed their teeth. But that's, I think it's wrong to characterise parents in that particular way. Parents do a good job, but there is clearly an issue.
I'm sorry, but if we culturally never do that, I'm sorry I have to interrupt, if we never do that, and I disagree, I don't think we talk actually about personal responsibility at all. I really don't. And if we constantly say, well, the issue is poverty, the question is what can government do, then we have this strange gap between you acknowledging that a problem exists, which is tooth decay so bad that kids are going into hospital to fix it, partly because they can't find a dentist, I understand that, but a gap between that and the question of what role does the individual have in solving that problem. And parents, for goodness sake, one of the few things you should be doing is brushing your kids' teeth.
Well, if parents can't get appointments for their children to
what's that got to do with brushing the children's teeth?
Checkups. You've made the point about, sometimes parents' work patterns means that there are a lot of struggles facing families today. So I don't think it's about asking the state to step in for every single issue in society, but where we have an issue that we can't deny, and children's health is suffering. Children are missing school because of tooth decay. It's putting a strain on the NHS. People can't get appointments. Then there is a way that we can step in and say, there will be this supervised toothbrushing in school to improve health outcomes.
And I'm all for it.
children.
I'm all for it. I just think, does the taxpayer have this permanent generosity, this permanent bottomless pit of money where it just keeps helping people to deal with problems that they themselves have not fixed and addressed, which begin with them?
Well, who would have thought that this issue, as the start of the programme, would have sparked such a big conversation between you all? I'm going to move on so that we can talk about some of the other things. You actually mentioned campaigning in Wellingborough. Well, that's because we've got more by-elections. It never rains, but it pours. We had a string of them last year, and you've got 2 more, expecting them on the 15th of February. You can see government announces by-elections in 2 Tory-held constituencies. They're voters in the constituencies of Kingswood, which is near Bristol, and Wellingborough, that you mentioned, Ellie, in Northamptonshire. Chris Skidmore, former Conservative minister, resigned his Kingswood seat in Parliament last week over his opposition to the government's green policies. And Peter Bone, you may remember, was suspended from the Parliamentary Conservative Party and subsequently recalled by his constituents after he was found to have committed acts of bullying and sexual misconduct by a parliamentary investigation. That, we are expecting, will happen, the by-elections, on the evening of Thursday, the 15th of February, but that's to be confirmed. Let's talk about borrowing, because you heard at the top of the programme also Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, talking about his green policies. Let's look at a little bit more of what he said.
It's absolutely clear to me that the Tories are trying to sort of weaponise this issue, the 28 billion, etc. This is a fight I want to have. If we can have a fight going into the election between an incoming Labour government that wants to invest in the future, long-term strategy that will lower our bills and give us energy independence, versus stagnation, more of the same under this government. If they want that fight on borrow to invest, I'm absolutely up for that fight.
So Keir Starmer's up for the fight over green policies. Other senior Labour figures have waded in too and been pretty outspoken. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, urges Labour to stick to its guns because there's been quite a lot of debate about how far it's been diluted, this £28 billion climate pledge. And the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, well, he must have been listening to Andy Burnham because he's written in the FT, or for the FT, Green Prosperity Plan will be ring-fenced, so that money will be spent on green policies, says senior Labour MP. So Keir Starmer wants that fight. He wants to fight to borrow to invest. I'm absolutely up for that. What does he mean exactly?
Well, we've put forward that green energy and growth, they go hand in hand, and it's part of Labour's missions if we are elected into government. And it's really important. We've set out our fiscal rules, which will underpin everything we do. Yes. So day-to-day spend being paid for by tax receipts, getting debt down as a proportion of GDP.
And this is going to form the centrepiece of your campaign, because you're the deputy campaign coordinator.
That's right, yep.
This is going to be the centrepiece of the election campaign.
Yeah, we will fight our election as a missions-based government, and this is key to all of that. But we've said it's subject to our fiscal rules, but this is a key area that we think is incredibly important in terms of energy security, lower bills, and creating the green jobs of the future.
So is borrow to invest, that sort of slogan, that ticket from Labour, do you think it's a vote winner?
Well, I think on these issues, people want lower bills. So bringing people's bills down by £1,400 by insulating the coldest homes, becoming a green energy superpower, bringing down bills, giving us energy security, and also creating those green jobs of the future. And people want to hear about those things.
Right. Well, so that's going to be your sort of plan. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has responded, in fact, directly to Andy Burnham. We saw his comments there. Sorry, Andy Burnham, but you have to pay debt interest on the £28 billion. Whether you call it spending or investment, money is money, and on this scale can only lead to tax rises, that looks as if it's going to be the shape of the Conservative response.
Well, we've said we'd ramp up to 28 billion by the end of the next Parliament. So, it's not day one, here we go, here's a cheque for 28 billion.
But it is going to be the centrepiece of the election campaign.
But we've said we will ramp up, and we've always said that, it's something that we will ramp up to in the next Parliament. It's not going to be a sort of day one, here's a blank cheque, and it's subject to our fiscal rules. So it's responsible investment, but it's also about creating jobs and growth, which we haven't seen in this country for a long time now.
Right, and are you going to use that attack line in response, Matt? The Jeremy Hunt line, that you can't borrow your way out of this and it'll cost us money?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's right. I think Labour will have to choose between either breaking that promise. Ellie talks about ramping up, and I get it, but when we then, because of those fiscal rules, don't get to that level of investment, it's clearly going to be a broken promise. Or if you want to get to that level of investment, as Jeremy Hunt says, you have to raise taxes. And this is the crucial point about what the election campaign is going to have to be about. It's about basic economic competence from a party that has consistently left Britain poorer than when it came into power. And that will be, of course, the Tory government has faced huge challenges, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the aftermath of the financial crisis, all of that. But what you're seeing, even at this stage, this far out from a Labour government, is hugely unaffordable spending pledges that simply are not going to be deliverable without tax rises.
Matt talks about people feeling poorer. I think most people, after 13 years of Conservative government, when taxes are higher, inflation has gone through the roof. People are paying more on their mortgage bills because of the Liz Truss budget that crashed the economy. Public services are on their knees. People can't get GP appointments. The hospital waiting lists are huge. I think it's a bit much to say that people felt worse off under Labour in this context of what's happened over the last 13 years.
If you're going to complain about the level of taxes now, are you going to cut them? How are you going to deliver those kinds of policies? I think it has to be for Labour to say, this is the plan that we will deliver. And right now, all we've got is an aspiration that might ramp up to some level and which you're not prepared to explain how you're going to pay for.
On taxes, we've talked about making the tax system fairer. For example, getting rid of non-dom tax loophole, so people that live here and work here should pay their taxes here as well, and that money will go in to more appointments in the NHS to get these waiting lists down, more scanners in the NHS, free breakfast clubs in every school, in every primary school. These are fully costed plans that we've put forward to put the money back into our public services.
Right. I mean, Ellie does mention, which is valid, why would anyone listen to the Conservatives after Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng borrowed or included £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts? And we know what happened after that. It's going to sound a bit rich coming from you to say you shouldn't borrow to invest.
I think Rishi Sunak's record speaks for itself. This is someone who has got inflation more than halved, who is already delivering on a lot of those targets that he's made. But you're right, of course, this has to be an election campaign fought on, saying this is what we've delivered and this is what we're going to continue to do. And it's right to say to Labour, when they say this is what we're going to do, for Conservatives and, of course, for journalists, to say, right, OK, how are you going to pay for it? And if you can't tell us how you're going to pay for it, that means either tax rises or more borrowing that has to be paid back by the public over time. None of that is good.
Do you think it's going to cut through with the public? Borrow to invest?
Well, I think you can frame it in so many different ways. When we look at the actual detail of a policy like this, we're talking about improving the energy efficiency of homes. That has a net benefit to society because we currently have people in cold homes. We have some of the worst housing stock in Europe. We could be talking about public transport and improving the levels of air pollution in our towns and cities. I think many traditional Conservative voters in rural parts of the country don't want to see massive sewage in some of their beautiful green spaces. I think, the cost of climate catastrophe could be so severe that we need to have very radical investment policies.
Should they be ramping up this £28 billion a year a little bit sooner then?
Well, I think Rachel Reeves in 2021 said it would be £28 billion a year, and it seems like we're just getting a sort of wishy-washy approach to this policy, and I think that's largely motivated by the fact that they think they're going to be attacked by the Tories on the fiscal competency. I think it's fiscally irresponsible not to invest in these policies.
Will it be popular with the voters, do you think? This idea, however you want to frame it, of borrowing to invest in green policies?
I just think the next election is going to be about the NHS and the cost of living. And both parties are dealing with issues that tend to rank about number 4 or 5 in terms of people's most important issues. Labour's going in on green stuff, the Tories are going in heavy on immigration. But I think actually it's pocketbook stuff that really matters. But Labour's in a slightly tricky spot here because just listening to that conversation, we're told that the spending, the borrowing to invest is ring-fenced, but not if it conflicts with Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules.
No, and they seem to be more important than the 28 billion.
And I think they're more important. And there is a slight tension within the Labour cabinet between Ed Miliband, who wants to do something, who wants to run in the next election on actually doing something other than just taxing private schools and non-doms, and Rachel Reeves, who's sort of saying, no, we've got to get elected on a clear fiscal perspective. So that means people can trust us and they know we're not going to repeat what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did.
I mean, unsurprisingly, it's not the first time Conservatives have attempted to criticise Labour for borrowing too much. Let's go back in time a little bit, although not now David Cameron is back in the Cabinet. But this is a clip from David Cameron as Prime Minister during the 2015 general election campaign.
I became Prime Minister at a time when there was no money left. And I bring this with me everywhere, the note that the Treasury Minister left. And there it is. Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money. Do we go right back to the start with Ed Miliband potentially propped up by the SNP, who want even more borrowing, even more spending, even more debt, all the things that landed us in that mess in the first place? I never want us to go back there again.
I mean, that was then. He won a small majority. Yeah, he won a small majority. And he was surprised. And now he's back. But would that work again? Would that work now against Labour after everything we've been through?
Well, I thought you were going to quote 1992 when the Tories hit Labour on its tax bombshell.
Yeah,
and the mistake that Labour famously made in 92 was it had John Smith, the Shadow Chancellor, decided I'm going to come out early and tell people precisely what I'm going to spend, and I'm going to make myself look really fiscally conservative. And it actually spooked people. So Labour coming out to the next election, they're caught in this trap of, do we persuade people that we're trustworthy because we're going to tell them what we're not going to do? Or do we try and win them over and make them feel ambitious for Britain by telling them what we are going to do?
Tash?
Yeah, no, I just think if we look at what's happened to the centre-left in Europe, there's some interesting studies done around how, mirroring centre-right tax and spend plans did not actually help the centre-left in elections because voters felt there wasn't much of a difference between the two parties, and we've seen the resurgence of the far right as well. So I think Labour needs to be very bold, and it should be very proud to be championing policies like this. I think we need to see a bit of a difference between the Tories and Labour, and policies like this is a way to do that.
Do you think caution first is not going to hold and be sustainable till the election, whenever that is, but probably in the autumn?
Well, it'd be nice to hear from Matt when he thinks the election would be. But, look, we're not going to set out every single policy at this stage.
No, I think it's more the sort of message you're sending and whether that will work. Against a background of what we know about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, maybe the Conservatives...
But that's why we've already set out a number of policies, as well as the Green Prosperity Plan. I talked about the 700,000 dentist appointments, the NHS appointments, the breakfast clubs in schools, the mental health support hubs for young people, the mental health workers in every school. These are important policies that the public want to hear about, and all of those things are fully costed. And we've been really clear that all of our policies will be fully costed going into a general election.
I mean, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, couldn't have been firmer in terms of certainly presenting ironclad discipline, perhaps reminiscent of Gordon Brown, certainly in what he said. Could Rishi Sunak do what David Cameron did there in 2015 and say the same sort of thing with any credibility?
I think that message of same old Labour, of leaving a country without the money that it needs, and when the Tories came in, I think that message fundamentally does still resonate. But elections are about much more than that. I think they have to be about talking about what is the plan for the future, and it has to also rest on a record of delivery. And those two things, I think, are where both parties inevitably should be focusing on. But what I want to see from my own party is that talk of the future as well, is that hopeful vision of what the future looks like, as well as saying that if you hand those reins over to Labour, you're going to end up with an economy that simply doesn't have the money to fund the public services that we need.
Ellie?
Well, you know, we've set out our plans that are fully costed for public services. All we've had under this Conservative government, we've had 13 years of it, is failure after failure after failure. You know, people can't get GP appointments, they can't get hospital appointments, they can't get the mental health support that they need for their children, they can't get on the housing ladder, their mortgages have gone up. You know, it's just a record of failure and of broken Britain.
To take one example, let's talk about those GP appointments, because Wes Streeting has said at one point that he seems to want to nationalise GPs, at another point that he doesn't. It's really important that Labour sets out what it is that you want to do in order that we can have that serious conversation, because until we do, you're simply going to be saying, well, we'll do something better. That's not good enough for the British public.
Well, this sounds like a rehearsal for a general election campaign, whenever that may be. Do you think it'll be in the autumn?
I'm told it's in the second half of this year.
Yeah, funnily enough, we've all been told that. So I was hoping we might be able to bring some more complexion to it. But anyway, let's talk about something different, because over the Christmas holidays, Dame Esther Rantzen spoke to Radio 4's Today programme about assisted dying. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
I have joined Dignitas. I have, in my brain, thought, well, if the next scan says nothing's working, I might buzz off to Zurich. If you watch someone you love having a bad death, that memory obliterates all the happy times. And I don't want that to happen.
In response to her comments, the Work and Pensions Secretary, Mel Stride, was asked for his views.
I wouldn't be averse to a situation if Parliament decided. Now, the government has not decided to bring forward legislation. I think I need to make that very clear. But if Parliament in some form or another decided that it wanted to have a fresh look at this, given that it was some years ago that we last did so, then that's not something that I would be resistant to.
And the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, was asked for his view too.
I personally do think there are grounds for changing the law. We have to be careful. But it would have to be, I think, a free vote on an issue where there are such divided and strong views.
I mean, Keir Starmer was saying he believes that there are grounds, he thinks, to change the law. Where do you stand on the issue?
I think that Keir is right in his comments, and any vote would have to be a free vote
yeah.
in Parliament. That's really important. The Health Select Committee, I think, is doing an inquiry into this at the moment, and one of the former Lewisham MPs and a good friend of mine, Joan Ruddock, gave incredibly powerful evidence to the Select Committee about the death of her husband, the late MP Frank Doran, and Frank was diagnosed with bowel cancer. Joan nursed him. He was in huge amount of pain, and Joan gave evidence saying, you know, in the hours before he died, he was in agony. She was on the phone to the emergency doctor saying, you know, unless you come and give pain relief, I don't know what I'm going to do. I might have to put, you know, a pillow over his head to end his pain and suffering. And, you know, that is just really powerful evidence. And Joan talks about, you know, assisted dying in strict controlled conditions, you know, where someone has a terminal illness, in extreme pain, and where they're fully cognizant. And I think that is pretty compelling.
Right. I mean, the last vote on this, I mean, it is powerful, compelling stuff, but equally, many people worry about what a law on assisted dying would bring. I mean, the last vote on this was back in 2015. Matt, you voted in favour of allowing terminally ill people to be given assistance to end their life. Why do you think it's the right thing to do?
So I think, for me, this fundamentally is about freedom. This is about the fact that if you or I, as able-bodied people who have that physical ability, wanted to end our lives, there's no law against it, there's nothing. And yet, in a moment of extreme pain, in a moment of extreme desperation, the state says no. And I think we can do better than that. And I think there are all sorts of difficult arguments about slippery slopes. There are all sorts of difficult arguments about how would you do it practically. It's our job in Parliament to stand on slippery slopes every day. And I think we are simply in the wrong place on this issue. Other countries have done better than we do. We have to have that debate. We have to say that the majority of the British public of all ages think that we can do better on this issue, and they see that there are people who are dying in unnecessary and extreme circumstances every day, and the only alternative seems to be, if you're rich enough, you can go to Dignitas in Switzerland. That is a kind of discrimination that is profoundly unfair, and we have to do better.
Philosophically, though, how do you feel about the idea of a law on assisted dying?
I'm a Christian, and for 2,000 years the dominant Christian ethic was that life is a gift from God, and that to take it away is to take away innocent life, and therefore it wasn't permissible. Things have changed. One, because we're no longer much of a Christian country and that ethic is fading away. And secondly, because medicine has changed. So people are living longer, we're more conscious of their pain and their suffering because medicine has improved. So that's why this debate is coming up. I am incredibly sympathetic towards those who wish to legalise it, partly because I myself, I'm 41, I've seen people die. I've seen people live with dementia. I understand. I know what they're talking about. But I think that putting my faith aside, I think there are still profound ethical issues with introducing it. One is that it transforms the nature of medicine. We in the West have always thought that medicine was about saving life. Now it will become partly about ending it. The second problem is the way in which definitions grow over time. So in countries where they have legalised it for very specific circumstances, the law has broadened so that now people can take their lives because they're in mental distress, for instance. And thirdly, and finally, Matt used this word freedom. In the West, the Enlightenment West, we have this fantasy idea that everyone makes a decision in some kind of perfect vacuum away from other people. They're in complete control of their destiny, and the choice is all theirs and it's totally rational. Well, first of all, when you are in extreme pain, you perhaps sometimes don't make the best decisions for yourself. And secondly, we live in a society, we are affected by other people and how they see us, and some people can feel pressured into taking their own life because they regard themselves as a burden. I fear that if we do this, we are tipping our society and culture ever further towards regarding life as something that we can give up on. Whereas I prefer it to tip the other direction, where we say that the job of the community is to help people, accompany them, relieve their suffering, but try as much as possible to preserve life, because it is, I come back to my faith. I regard life, this fundamental motivating principle of my social morality. Life is sacred, and we have a responsibility to try to preserve it.
Matt?
No one is arguing that this is a sort of counsel of giving up. This is about finding the best possible solutions. It has to be in conjunction with the best possible palliative care. It has to be in conjunction with preserving life as much as it possibly can be. And no doctor is going to take any of these decisions lightly. But my simple point is that there are extreme circumstances where we could and should do better. And for Parliament not even to have had that debate for a number of years now, when we know that public opinion has shifted pretty quickly, even though it was already firmly out of kilter with that last parliamentary vote, I just think its time has come to know that we can do better and to get on with doing better.
I just say on the point about extreme circumstances, and this is, you know, as a very good parliamentarian and debater, you know that we don't make law on the basis of anecdote. I'm not dismissing those human experiences, but we don't make it on the basis of extreme cases. There's a philosophical principle here. In the 1960s, when we legalised abortion, the argument was partly that abortion would go down because we'd be getting rid of backstreet abortions and it would be a completely different... Instead, we now have 200,000 people a year being aborted. And this is my fear with assisted dying. When you change the law, you switch things, you flick a switch, and you move things away from the principle that we're about preserving life, and you switch it towards this possibility of actually we're about helping people to end it. That's the philosophical principle that I'm opposed to.
Taj?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex issue, and I think people have very, very strong views on it based on personal experience. I remember reading about Yasmin Qureshi, the Labour MP, who spoke about how I think it was her mother who was diagnosed with cancer, who almost felt like a burden, and she'd recovered a few years later. And so I think it's really, really important that, you know, we have the debate. I think we absolutely should have the debate in Parliament, but we really need to, you know, think about this very, very carefully. I think it's very important that people have the choice. Individual autonomy is important, and regardless of your own religious views, you can't impose those on anyone else. But yes, I think in principle, a debate is absolutely the right thing to do.
A debate, fine, but on the principle, Ellie, I mean, are you convinced by what you heard from Tim and Taj, particularly this idea that people in extreme distress, in extreme pain, sometimes can recover, do recover with the right care, and might have made a wrong decision at the time or felt some pressure from family members or friends to end their life?
Well, I think we need to have a debate in Parliament about it. But certainly for me, you know, I've talked about people that have a terminal illness, not people that are very unwell and are, you know, that may recover. You know, for me, it would be about people that are terminally ill. Other people may have different views on that. But that's why it is actually important that we have the discussion and debate, because even within the principle of whether or not you support assisted dying, people may have different views about when actually it should be allowed to take place, and there'll be different views on that as well.
All right, let's talk about politics on mainland Europe. You heard and saw Marine Le Pen in the headlines. Her party, as other far-right parties on mainland Europe, are doing well, and they're doing well with young people. Let's have a look at some of the images from Marine Le Pen's national rally, who have won 3 seats in September's Senate elections, a better than expected result, and they already hold 89 seats in the National Assembly. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders won November's general election. Coalition talks are still ongoing in his bid to form a government, his party being Party for Freedom. And in Austria, which has an election this year, all eyes are on Herbert Kickl's Freedom Party, which has been leading the polls for the past 12 months. Now, someone who's been looking at this and why young people in particular are being drawn in larger numbers to these parties is Oxford University's Professor James Tilley. He joins us now. He's also presenting a series for BBC Radio 4 next week called The Kids Are Alt-Right. Hello to you, James. In the radio documentary, you use the term radical right. People use different terms to describe these parties. But what is the radical right?
That's a good question. I like radical right because I think it's the best summary of these parties. And there's 2 words there, radical and right. The radical bit, I think, refers to parties that really want to change the status quo, typically use anti-establishment rhetoric, have quite a black and white view of politics. And of course, that's true of lots of small parties who haven't been in government or unlikely to be in government. Radical right parties, but also radical left parties, some green parties. And then the right bit of radical right refers to the policies. And I think right can be a bit misleading sometimes because these parties don't tend to actually have economically right-wing policies. They're often quite centrist on economic policy. And similarly, although they're generally more socially conservative than mainstream parties, that's not always the case. So really, in policy terms, they have one core issue, which is wanting more restrictive immigration policies. And in fact, actually, that's typically how we kind of political scientists almost define those parties in many ways.
Right. I mean, interesting, James, in terms of your descriptions. Why, then, are they appealing to young people more and more?
Yeah, good question. That's what the documentary is all about.
Yeah.
I guess in Britain, we kind of used, I think, to think about radical right parties, so UKIP or Reform, as perhaps attracting older voters. And that is true in a lot of other countries as well. But in some Western European countries, radical right parties are currently more successful with the young than the old. And I think there's kind of 2 things to consider, really. On the one hand, you've got as people age, they change. And on the other hand, you've got people born at different times have different views because their experiences when they're young kind of shape their political attitudes. So we start with aging. Aging tends to generally shift our personality and to some extent our personal circumstances in a way which fits better with right-wing policies. And also people born longer ago tend to be more socially conservative because the status quo when they were young was more socially conservative. So that would make you think that older people and older generations were more likely to vote for the radical right. And in some countries like Britain, that's true. But the other side of the coin is that aging also shifts our personality to dislike new, risky, radical options for change. So that would make radical parties less appealing to older people. And also people born longer ago will have grown up when mainstream parties, so Social Democrats and Christian Democrats on the continent, were the dominant parties. So those people have a kind of political team which they'll stick with from before, unlike new generations who are kind of free to choose from the smorgasbord of parties that are available. So you've got these kind of competing forces, both aging and generational, and obviously how they play out depends very much on the circumstances in the individual country.
Stay with us, James. Tim, are you surprised that these sorts of parties on mainland Europe are attracting younger voters more and more?
No, I'm not. Perhaps the outlier is actually Britain, where the young people tend to be left-wing. Because if you go to, say, Canada, the Conservative Party there is very popular among the young as well. And the galvanising issue there is housing. And so it's partly just a reaction to whoever is perceived to be the establishment. And it's perceived that the establishment across Europe is liberal left. And therefore, if you're young and if you think the economy is stagnating, your future chances have been reduced, but also you think there's something wrong with your continent's culture, that you're heading in a bad direction, it's sort of natural that you'd switch against the left. The left has no alternative narrative. The right does have one that's very attractive to some people. And it's a narrative about belonging and about identity, which the left has sort of rejected.
Tash?
No, I think it's a fascinating discussion to be had because, I grew up in Luton, which is a very diverse, multicultural area. Most of my friends happen to be British Muslims, and some of their views could be quite socially conservative, but also very economically left-wing. And I think there's a substantial chunk of this country, that may have those views. And I therefore think it's far too easy to label people as radical right or radical left. It's far more complicated. I mean, I look at people like...
But if they're supporting those parties that are sort of describing themselves as radical right on mainland Europe, I mean, are you surprised? I suppose because of my age.
Yeah.
I always think traditionally, when you're young, a lot of young people support radical left parties. And yet young people, maybe for the issues that Tim was suggesting, housing, are supporting radical right on mainland Europe?
Well, I think there's two things here. The one thing is it's definitely a sense of being anti-establishment, saying that the major parties are all the same. We've not seen our communities change, our living standards haven't improved, and we want something different, and you're being offered something different. Equally, I do think that this is somewhat of a backlash to liberal identity politics, devoid of any understanding of class, community, belonging. And I think the left needs to be better at providing a narrative, giving people a sense of hope and actually saying, we want to bring the country together. We believe in collectivism. We believe in, as someone on the left, I believe in the very beautiful traditions of trade unionism. I believe that we've done some amazing things collectively organising for better pay and conditions. The NHS was established. These are fantastic things that we should be proud of. And I think that argument around tradition and pride and identity is something that the left cannot afford to cede to the right.
James, do you think it is about anti-establishment, that's the core? What about issues like housing? Has that also driven younger voters into the arms of far-right parties in Europe?
I kind of didn't really mention anything about policy there. Obviously, policies are important as well. I mean, I'd say specific policies that parties offer tend to generally not really matter because most people don't know what they are. But, I mean, groups of parties do have core policy offerings that they have something about. And I guess radical right parties have the core policy offering of immigration. And if you think about what affects people's immigration attitudes, then, we often tend to think of it as a kind of cultural factor and an economic factor. And those are related to age in different ways. So older people typically are seen as facing more of the cultural costs of immigration. If I'm older, I've been around longer, I'm more attached to the national culture as is. So if it changes, then I'm going to find that less appealing. Whereas younger people tend to face more of the economic costs of immigration. So competition in the labour market, but as you said, in the housing market as well. And that was, I think, a relatively big issue in the Netherlands in the last election.
Yes.
So I think it depends on whether these economic or cultural factors are more important in immigration attitudes.
Thank you, James, because we haven't got long. Briefly, something you should worry about?
Well, I think politics has to be about a narrative and policies flow from that. And the simplistic narratives of far-right, far-left parties are always going to be attractive. It's a duty on mainstream politicians to have that vision that you can talk about that then allows you to say these are why the policies that are relatively centrist not only will work, but are something that the public can get behind.
Only a few seconds for you, Ellie.
Well, I think that it's a really important debate that we have to have. And when people lose hope in politics and politicians, then that's when we see the rise of extremism. I want to see a general election so that we can have a change in this country and offer people hope.
It'll come soon enough, we hope. That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.